In February of 1847, a small group of men on makeshift snowshoes crested a ridge in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. They had been climbing for days through snow so deep it buried entire forests. They were searching for something, or rather, someone. 81 people had vanished into these mountains 4 months ago, and no one had heard from them since. The rescue party expected to find graves. What they found was far worse. At first, they saw nothing but white, an endless, silent expanse of snow stretching towards the frozen lake below. Then one of the men noticed something strange. Thin columns of smoke rising from the ground itself, as if the earth were breathing. They called out. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from holes in the snow, dark, hollow figures crawling up from what the rescuers suddenly realized were the roofs of buried cabins. The survivors looked, in the words of one rescuer, more like demons than human beings. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes were enormous and empty. They moved slowly, as if they had forgotten how to walk in daylight. Some of them wept when they saw the rescue party. Others simply stared, unable to believe that help had finally come. But the true horror was not written on their faces. It was scattered around the camps, in the strange butchered remains that lay half hidden in the snow. Bones that had been cracked open for their marrow, flesh that had been carved from bodies the rescuers recognized as human. The Donner Party had done what they needed to do to survive. And in doing so, they had become a legend. America's most infamous example of what happens when civilization crumbles, when ordinary people are pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, and when the only choice left is the one no one should ever have to make. Most people know exactly one thing about the Donner Party. They ate each other. It has become a punchline, a dark joke, a single sensational word, cannibalism, that erases everything else about who these people were and what they endured. We remember the horror, but we have forgotten the humanity. The truth is far more complicated and far more tragic. The Donner Party was not a group of monsters. They were 87 ordinary people, teachers, farmers, businessmen, mothers and children, who made one bad decision that led to another, until they found themselves trapped in a frozen nightmare with no way out. They were chasing the American dream, the promise of free land and a fresh start in California. They did everything right. They planned carefully. They saved their money. They believed in the future. And they ended up in hell. Tonight, we are going to tell their real story. Not the myth of monsters in the mountains, but the tragedy of hope and ambition gone terribly wrong. We will meet the families who set out with such high expectations, the businessman whose pride led them astray, the children who witnessed horrors no child should ever see, and the survivors who lived the rest of their lives haunted by the question that haunts us still. What would you have done? Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark histories and forgotten tragedies are worth remembering, if you believe the stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances should not be lost to time, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows of history. Tonight, we will follow the Donner Party from their hopeful departure in Illinois to their frozen nightmare in the Sierra Nevada. We will watch as small mistakes compound into catastrophe, as trust gives way to suspicion, and as the veneer of civilization slowly cracks and crumbles. We will meet the ambitious businessman who convinced them to take a shortcut that didn't exist. We will witness the desperate escape attempt of 15 starving souls through a frozen wilderness. And we will sit with the survivors in their snow-buried cabins as they face the impossible choice that would define them forever. This is a story about the American dream turned inside out, about what happens when the promise of paradise leads you straight to hell, about the terrifying question of what any of us might become when survival is the only thing that matters. To understand their fate, we must first understand their hope. Before they were victims, they were dreamers. Before the snow and the starvation, there was sunshine and optimism. And to solve the riddle of what they became, we must first travel back to the beginning, to meet the families who believed they were walking toward a better life. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand the Donner Party, you must first understand the fever that gripped America in the 1840s. It was called Oregon fever, or California or bust, and it was a kind of madness, a collective dream that swept through the young nation like wildfire. The promise was almost too good to be true. In the West, they said, land was free for the taking, valleys stretched for miles, rich with dark soil that had never felt a plow. Rivers ran thick with fish. The climate was mild, the forests endless, and there were no landlords, no debts, no past to escape from. All you had to do was get there. And so they came by the thousands, farmers tired of working someone else's land, merchants seeking new markets, young families dreaming of a fresh start. They loaded everything they owned into covered wagons, said goodbye to everyone they knew, and set out on a 2,000-mile journey across plains, deserts, and mountains that most of them had never seen. The journey was supposed to take about 5 months. Leave in the spring when the grass was high enough to feed your oxen. Cross the plains through the summer. Make it over the mountains before the first snow. Thousands had done it before. It was hard, yes, but it was possible. It was the path to paradise. What the emigrants didn't always understand was how narrow the window of safety really was. The timing had to be perfect. Leave too early, and there wouldn't be enough grass on the plains to feed the animals. Leave too late, and the snow would close the mountain passes before you could cross. The margin for error was measured in weeks, sometimes in days. And in 1846, a group of families from Illinois was about to learn just how unforgiving that margin could be. The two families at the heart of this story could not have been more different in temperament, though they shared the same ambition. George Donner was 62 years old, ancient by the standards of the frontier. He had already lived a full life as a prosperous farmer in Illinois, with land, money, and the respect of his community. He had nothing to prove and nothing to escape. But George Donner was a dreamer. The idea of California, of one last great adventure before the end, had taken hold of him and would not let go. His wife Tamsin, a former schoolteacher, shared his enthusiasm. She imagined opening a school for young ladies in California, spreading education and culture to the new frontier. They were idealists, both of them. George's brother Jacob Donner joined them, bringing his own large family. Together, the Donner clan numbered more than a dozen souls, including children as young as 3 years old. Then there was James Frazier Reed. Reed was everything George Donner was not: ambitious, proud, and hungry for status. He was an Irish immigrant who had clawed his way up from nothing to become a wealthy businessman. He had fought in the Black Hawk War alongside a young Abraham Lincoln. He had made his fortune, and now he wanted more: land, prestige, a legacy for his children. Reed's wagon told you everything you needed to know about him. While most emigrants traveled in simple covered wagons, Reed had commissioned a 2-story rolling mansion that the other travelers nicknamed the Pioneer Palace car. It had a built-in iron stove for cooking and heat. It had spring-cushioned seats for comfort. It had a small library of books. It even had an entrance on the side, like a stagecoach, so his invalid mother-in-law could enter without climbing. The Reed family traveled with servants, fine china, and more supplies than most small towns. James Reed intended to arrive in California as a gentleman, and he intended everyone along the way to know it. This was the tension that would simmer beneath the surface of the entire journey. The Donners with their gentle optimism, Reed with his relentless ambition, and all around them, families of more modest means, watching the rich folks and wondering if they really knew what they were getting into. Among those families were the Breens, Irish Catholics with 7 children; the Murphys, a sprawling clan of Irish Protestants; the Eddies, young newlyweds with 2 small children; and dozens of others whose names would soon be carved into the dark history of the American West. In total, there were 12 children under the age of 12, babies who would take their first steps on the trail, toddlers who would learn to walk through desert sand and mountain snow, 8-year-old Patty Reed, who carefully packed a tiny wooden doll to keep her company on the journey, 3-year-old Eliza Donner, too young to understand where they were going or why. These were the innocents, and they would see things no child should ever see. In April of 1846, the families gathered in Springfield, Illinois, for the great departure. The wagons were loaded, the oxen yoked, and the emigrants said their final goodbyes to friends and relatives they would never see again. It was a festive atmosphere. Neighbors came to wish them well. Children ran between the wagons, excited for the adventure ahead. There were prayers and tears and promises to write. The wagon train that set out that spring was like a small moving city. By the time they reached Independence, Missouri, the traditional jumping-off point for the westward trails, they had joined with other emigrant parties to form a caravan of several hundred people. There was safety in numbers on the plains, protection from the native tribes and the lawless men who preyed on isolated travelers. The early weeks were almost pleasant. The weather was mild. The grass was green and plentiful. The oxen were strong, and the wagons rolled steadily westward. At night, the families would circle their wagons, build fires, and share meals. Children played together, young people flirted, old men told stories. It felt less like a dangerous journey and more like an extended camping trip. But even in those early golden days, there were signs of trouble. The wagon train was large and unwieldy. Decisions took forever to make. Personalities clashed. James Reed, with his fancy wagon and imperious manner, rubbed people the wrong way. Some of the emigrants resented his wealth. Others resented his attitude. Small arguments broke out over trivial things: whose turn it was to lead the train, where to make camp, how fast to travel. And there was one other thing, one small, seemingly insignificant detail that would change everything. They were already behind schedule. The spring rains had delayed their departure by several weeks. It was a small delay, Nothing that seemed worth worrying about. They would make up the time on the trail. Everyone said so. But in the mathematics of the westward migration, there was no room for small delays. Every lost day was a day closer to winter. Every extra hour was an hour the snow was gathering in the mountains ahead. The emigrants did not know it yet, but they were already running out of time. By the time the wagon train reached Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming, the cracks were beginning to show. The novelty of the journey had worn off. The days were hot and dusty. The oxen were tired. The children were restless and irritable, and the adults were starting to worry. They were definitely behind schedule now. Everyone could feel it. The original plan had called for them to be much farther along by this point. The question was what to do about it. It was at Fort Laramie that they received a letter that would seal their fate. The letter was from a man named Lansford Hastings, a promoter and would-be empire builder who had written a popular guidebook called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. Hastings was not a mountain man or an experienced guide. He was a lawyer and a land speculator who had only crossed the Sierra Nevada once, and that on horseback with a small party, not with wagons. But his book was full of confident advice, and emigrants trusted it. In his letter, Hastings made an extraordinary claim. He said he had discovered a new route to California, a shortcut that would save emigrants 300 to 400 miles on their journey. He called it the Hastings Cutoff, and he promised to personally guide any wagon trains that wanted to take it. The established trail went north through Fort Hall in present-day Idaho, then curved southwest toward California. It was tried and tested. Thousands of wagons had made it through, but it was long, hundreds of extra miles that would take weeks to cover. Hastings Cutoff went due west from Fort Bridger, straight through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. It was shorter on the map. It was completely untested for wagon travel, and Hastings himself had never actually taken wagons through it. Most of the wagon train decided to stick with the proven route. The risk was too great, the promise too uncertain. But a smaller group of families, about 20 wagons, decided to take the shortcut. Leading that group was George Donner, the eternal optimist, who believed the best of everyone and everything. And strongly supporting him was James Reed, whose heavy Pioneer Palace car was slowing the whole party down. Reed desperately needed a shorter route. The cutoff seemed like salvation. At the Little Sandy River in present-day Wyoming, the Donner Party made their fateful decision. They said goodbye to the main wagon train and turned south toward Fort Bridger and the Hastings Cutoff. "Don't worry," George Donner told the families who were staying on the main trail. "We'll beat you to California by weeks." They didn't know that Lansford Hastings had already left Fort Bridger with an earlier party. They didn't know that he would not be there to guide them. They didn't know that the shortcut he had promised would cost them weeks they couldn't afford to lose. They didn't know that they had just made the decision that would kill half of them. The oxen strained against their yokes. The wagons creaked and groaned, and the Donner Party rolled forward into the unknown, chasing a promise that had already turned to dust. When the Donner Party reached Fort Bridger, they found a crude trading post run by the famous mountain man, Jim Bridger. Bridger told them exactly what they wanted to hear. The Hastings Cutoff was a fine route, well watered, with good grass for the animals. He failed to mention that he had a financial stake in promoting the cutoff, which would bring more traffic past his trading post. He also failed to mention that no wagon train had ever successfully completed the route. Hastings himself was gone, leading a larger party that had left weeks earlier, but he had left a note promising to mark the trail and wait for following parties at certain points. The Donner Party pushed on, confident they were on the right path. Then they reached the Wasatch Mountains, and everything fell apart. The trail Hastings had promised simply did not exist. Instead of a clear path, they found a wall of mountains covered in dense forest, tangled brush, and massive boulders. There was no way through for a wagon. There was barely a way through for a man on foot. They would have to build their own road. What followed was 36 days of backbreaking, soul-crushing labor. The men took axes to the forest, chopping down trees, clearing brush, rolling boulders out of the way. They worked from dawn until dark, hacking a path through terrain that seemed designed to stop them. Some days they advanced less than 2 miles. Some days they made no progress at all. Meanwhile, the women and children waited in camp, watching the food supplies dwindle, watching the oxen grow thin and weak, watching the calendar pages turn. They all knew what the delay meant. Every day lost in these mountains was a day closer to winter in the Sierra Nevada ahead. When they finally emerged from the Wasatch, they had lost more than a month. They were exhausted, demoralized, and running dangerously low on supplies. The shortcut that was supposed to save them time had cost them 5 weeks. But the worst was yet to come. After the mountains came the desert, a vast white expanse of salt flats that stretched to the horizon like a frozen sea. Hastings' guidebook had mentioned this desert. He had described it as 40 miles of hard driving. He was wrong by half. The Great Salt Lake Desert was 80 miles across, and it was one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They entered the desert in early September, hoping to cross in 2 days. The first day was brutal, scorching sun, no shade, no water, the salt crust cracking under the wagon wheels like broken glass. The children cried from thirst. The oxen stumbled and bellowed. The salt worked its way into every crack and crevice, burning skin and lips and eyes. By the second day, the animals began to die. The desert seemed to go on forever. The 40 miles Hastings had promised became 50, then 60, then 70. Some of the oxen went mad from thirst and broke free of their yokes, running off into the white emptiness to die. Others simply collapsed where they stood, their tongues swollen, their eyes rolling back in their heads. James Reed lost most of his oxen in the desert crossing. His magnificent Pioneer Palace car, the symbol of his ambition and pride, had to be abandoned in the salt. He stood and watched as his family's possessions, the furniture, the books, the fine china, were left behind in the white waste. Everything he had worked for, everything he had planned, left to bleach in the desert sun. By the time they reached water on the other side, the Donner Party had lost 36 head of cattle and several wagons. They were now dependent on the charity of other families for food and transportation. The proud James Reed was reduced to borrowing oxen from neighbors who had once envied his wealth. The mood in the party had changed. The optimism was gone. In its place was a simmering anger, at Hastings for his lies, at themselves for believing him, at each other for every small decision that had led them to this disaster. The families that had started the journey as neighbors and friends now regarded each other with suspicion and resentment. They had lost their supplies, they had lost their animals, and slowly they were losing their humanity. The tension that had been building for weeks finally exploded in October, somewhere along the Humboldt River in present-day Nevada. The incident began over something trivial: a tangled team of oxen, a wagon stuck on a steep hillside. John Snyder, a young teamster working for one of the families, was trying to force his oxen up the slope. James Reed was trying to help. Their teams became entangled. Harsh words were exchanged. Then Snyder raised his bullwhip and brought it down across the head of James Reed's wife, Margaret. What happened next took only seconds. Reed, seeing his wife struck, grabbed his hunting knife and lunged at Snyder. The blade went into Snyder's chest. Snyder staggered backward, struck Reed over the head with the whip handle, then collapsed. Within minutes, he was dead. The party erupted. Some demanded that Reed be hanged immediately. Others argued it was self-defense, or at least justifiable given that Snyder had struck a woman. For hours, the emigrants argued over what to do. Reed's friends pleaded for his life. His enemies called for execution. In the end, they reached a compromise that was really no compromise at all. James Reed was banished from the party. He was to leave immediately, alone, without weapons, without food, and ride ahead to California. If he survived the journey, he might be able to send back help. If he died in the wilderness, well, that was God's judgment. Reed said goodbye to his wife and 4 children, not knowing if he would ever see them again. His daughter Virginia, 13 years old, secretly followed him on her pony and pressed a rifle and some food into his hands before turning back. It was an act of love that may have saved his life. Then James Reed rode away into the desert, and the Donner Party continued westward, one family smaller, the cracks in their unity now a yawning chasm. October turned to November. The nights grew cold. The emigrants could see the Sierra Nevada rising in the west, a wall of granite and snow blocking the path to California. They were so close now, so close, and so far behind schedule. Along the way, they suffered more losses. An elderly man named Hardcoop, too weak to walk and with no one willing to give him space in a wagon, was left behind to die. A German emigrant named Wolfinger disappeared, murdered, some said, by 2 men who had offered to help him cache his belongings, though the truth was never proven. Paiute Indians harassed the struggling party, stealing cattle and shooting arrows at the livestock. The emigrants fired back, killing several Native Americans, but the losses continued. More oxen died. More wagons were abandoned. The party that had left Illinois with such high hopes was now a ragged, desperate band of refugees. By late October, they reached the base of the Sierra Nevada. They could see the pass they needed to cross, a narrow gap in the mountains that led to the Sacramento Valley and safety. They could also see dark clouds gathering over the peaks. Snow was already falling in the high country. The winter of 1846 would come early that year, one of the earliest and most severe in California history. The emigrants didn't know it yet, but they had run out of time. They made their final push on November 3rd. The snow was falling steadily now, blanketing the trail in white, hiding the rocks and roots that could break a wagon wheel or snap an ox's leg. The pass was only a few miles ahead. A few hours of hard climbing and they would be safe. They tried twice. Both times, the snow was too deep, the drifts too high. The wagons bogged down. The oxen could not find footing. The trail disappeared under the white blanket, and no one could find the way forward. By nightfall, it was over. The snow was still falling, harder now, and there was no hope of crossing. They turned back, retreating down the mountain to a small lake at the base of the pass, a lake that would later bear their name. The Donner Party was trapped. Behind them, the mountains they had struggled so hard to reach. Ahead of them, a pass blocked by walls of snow 20 feet high. Above them, a storm that would not stop for months. 81 souls, including women and children and babies, trapped in a frozen valley with dwindling supplies and no hope of rescue until spring. Spring was 5 months away. Before we continue, we must shift our perspective. The story we have told so far has been about decisions and consequences, about adults making choices that would determine the fate of dozens. But to truly understand what happened at Truckee Lake, what it felt like to live through those long, dark months, we must see it through different eyes. The eyes of a child. Virginia Reed was 13 years old when the snows came. She was the daughter of James Reed, the man who had been banished for killing John Snyder. Her father was somewhere out in the wilderness, alive or dead, and she did not know which. Her mother was sick with worry and growing weaker by the day. Her younger siblings looked to her for strength she did not have. Years later, Virginia would write about those months in the mountains. Her account is one of the most important primary sources we have, and it reveals something that the adult narratives often miss. The terrible confusion of being young and afraid and not understanding why the world had suddenly become so cruel. For the children of the Donner Party, there was no context, no explanation. They did not understand the chain of decisions that had led them to this place. They only knew that the wagons had stopped moving, that the snow would not stop falling, that the adults were frightened, and that there was not enough to eat. Through their eyes, we see the horror stripped of all rationalization, all adult justification. We see it as it truly was, a nightmare from which there was no waking. The emigrants split into 2 camps, separated by 6 miles of frozen wilderness. At the lake, later called Donner Lake, the majority of the party built crude shelters against the eastern slope of the mountain. They constructed 3 rough cabins, using logs from the sparse forest and hides from their slaughtered oxen. The Breen family took 1 cabin. The Murphy family and their extended clan took another. The Reeds, Graveses, and others crowded into the 3rd. The cabins were dark, cramped, and miserable, but they were better than being outside. 6 miles away, at a place called Alder Creek, the Donner brothers and their families were in far worse condition. They had not made it to the lake before the storm hit. George Donner had injured his hand badly while trying to repair a wagon axle, and the wound had become infected. Too weak to continue, the Donners had made camp where they were, building only crude lean-tos and tents that offered little protection from the cold. As November turned to December, the snow continued to fall. It fell in amounts that seemed impossible, burying the landscape under a white shroud that grew deeper every day. Within weeks, the drifts were 10 feet high, then 15, then 20. The cabins at the lake became buried. The emigrants dug trenches to reach their doors, then tunnels as the snow rose higher. Eventually, they were living entirely underground, climbing up through holes in the snow to reach the surface. The world shrank to the size of a single dark room, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies and wet hides and something else, the smell of slow starvation. In those first weeks, the emigrants still had hope. They slaughtered their remaining cattle and horses, carving the meat into strips and letting the mountain cold preserve it. They rationed carefully, believing that rescue would come before the food ran out. But the snow kept falling, burying the slaughtered cattle under drifts so deep they could not be found. One by one, the precious carcasses disappeared beneath the white. The emigrants dug frantically, trying to recover the meat they had cached, but the snow was too deep, and the landmarks they had used were gone. Hunting was impossible. The deer and elk had fled to lower elevations months ago. Fishing was impossible. The lake was frozen solid under feet of ice and snow. The emigrants were reduced to eating the hides they had used to roof their cabins, boiling them for hours to create a foul, gelatinous soup that provided almost no nutrition. Patrick Breen, an Irish farmer, kept a diary throughout the ordeal. His entries, written in plain, matter-of-fact language, are the most complete record we have of what happened in those cabins. Reading them now, you can trace the slow descent from hope to despair. November 22nd. Froze hard last night. Began to snow again about 10 o'clock. Now, about 3 feet deep. December 8th. Fine, clear morning. Mrs. Reed, and children here. Very hard to get wood. December 17th. Pleasant. Baylis Williams died last night. Baylis Williams was the first to die at the lake camp, a young hired hand who had joined the Reed family. He was buried in the snow near the cabin. He would not be the last. By December, everyone knew the truth. No one was coming to rescue them. The pass was buried under 20 feet of snow. Even if someone in California knew they were trapped, there was no way to reach them until spring, and spring was 4 months away. The food would not last 4 months. It would not last 4 weeks. In mid-December, a group of the strongest and most desperate emigrants made a decision. They would try to walk out over the pass, through the snow and the cold, to get help from the settlements in the Sacramento Valley. It was almost certainly a death sentence, but staying in the camps was also a death sentence, only slower. They made crude snowshoes from salvaged oxbows and strips of rawhide. They gathered what little food could be spared, 6 days of rations for a journey that would take, if they survived, at least 2 weeks. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. It was the perfect name. On December 16th, 1846, 15 people set out from the lake camp into the frozen wilderness. 10 men and 5 women, wrapped in whatever clothes they could find, their feet bound in rags, their faces set against the bitter wind. Among them was William Eddy, a young carriage maker who had lost nearly everything in the desert crossing. Among them were 2 Miwok Native American guides, Louis and Salvador, who had joined the party earlier and now volunteered to help lead the way. Among them was Charles Stanton, a bachelor who had made it to California for supplies and then returned to help the stranded emigrants, only to become trapped with them. They climbed into the mountains, into the snow and the silence, leaving behind their families, their friends, and any certainty that they would ever see another human face again. Behind them, in the buried cabins, the remaining emigrants watched them go. Some wept, some prayed, and some, looking at the dwindling pile of boiled hides that was all they had left to eat, began to think the unthinkable. The Forlorn Hope had 6 days of food. The journey would take 33. The 15 members of the Forlorn Hope climbed into a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. The snow was so deep that they walked on top of buried forests, their snowshoes crunching over the tips of pine trees that would have towered 60 feet above them in summer. The cold was beyond anything they had experienced, so intense that their breath froze in their beards. and the tears froze on their cheeks before they could fall. For the first few days, they made progress. The weather held. The snowshoes worked. They rationed their meager food carefully, allowing themselves only a few bites each day. They told themselves that if they could just keep moving, if they could just reach the other side of the mountains, they would survive. Charles Stanton, who had made the crossing before, served as their guide. But Stanton had been snowblind for days, his eyes damaged by the glare of sun on snow. He stumbled along at the rear of the group, unable to see, navigating by memory and the sound of the others' voices. On the morning of the 6th day, Stanton sat down in the snow and lit his pipe. The others urged him to get up, to keep moving. He waved them on. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll be along soon." He was never seen again. He had given his life to help people who were not even his family, and in the end, he died alone in the snow, watching them walk away through eyes that could no longer see. The food ran out on Christmas Eve, and that was the night the storm hit. It came howling out of the mountains with a fury that seemed almost personal, a wall of wind and snow that drove the temperature down to levels that would kill exposed flesh in minutes. The 14 remaining members of the Forlorn Hope huddled together in the open, trying to build a fire, trying to stay alive. They had no tents, no shelter, no food. They sat in a circle, their blankets wrapped around them, the snow piling higher and higher, and they waited to die. The storm lasted 4 days. During those 4 days, they burned everything they had: snowshoes, gun stocks, the leather straps from their packs, trying to keep even a small fire going. They pressed together for warmth. The living and the dying mixed together in a mass of freezing bodies. Some of them became delirious, calling out for people who weren't there, trying to walk off into the snow to their deaths. When the storm finally broke on December 29th, 4 of the 15 were dead. Antonio, a Mexican herder; Franklin Graves, a family patriarch; Patrick Dolan, an Irish bachelor; and Lemuel Murphy, barely into his 20s. The 11 survivors stood in the snow, looking at each other, and knew what they had to do. This is the moment the Donner Party entered legend, not at the lake camps, but here, on a frozen mountainside, among a desperate band of survivors who had run out of options. They were starving. They had been without food for days. They had no chance of reaching safety without sustenance. And there, in the snow around them, were 4 bodies that would never need their flesh again. The decision was not made lightly. Some argued against it on religious grounds. Some could not bear the thought. But in the end, survival won out over scruple. They established rules. No one would eat their own family members. The flesh would be stripped from the bones and dried so that it no longer looked human. They would not speak of it. They would not look at each other while they ate. And then, in the terrible silence of the mountains, they did what they had to do to survive. The 2 Miwok guides, Luis and Salvador, refused to participate. They had not been raised in the same traditions as the white emigrants. The idea of eating human flesh was an abomination to them, a violation of everything they believed. They sat apart from the group, growing weaker by the day, watching the others survive on food they could not bring themselves to touch. Luis and Salvador were not members of the Donner Party. They were Miwok Indians who had been living and working at Sutter's Fort in California when the emigrant crisis began. They had volunteered to help guide the trapped families to safety, risking their lives for people they did not know. Now, Having refused to eat the flesh of the dead, they were the weakest members of the group. They could barely walk. They were clearly dying. And then William Foster made a suggestion. Foster was a young man, still in his 20s, who had watched his brother-in-law die in the storm. He was half mad with hunger and cold and grief, and he suggested that they kill Luis and Salvador while they were still alive, before they died of starvation and their flesh became too lean to be useful. William Eddy, one of the more humane members of the group, was horrified. He told Foster he would shoot him if he tried to harm the guides. For a tense moment, the two men faced each other in the snow, one arguing for murder, the other threatening violence to prevent it. Eddy won that argument, but it didn't matter. Luis and Salvador, overhearing the debate, slipped away from the camp during the night. They could not walk far in their condition, and they knew what was coming. A few days later, the Forlorn Hope caught up with them. Luis and Salvador were lying in the snow, unable to move, barely conscious. William Foster walked up to them and shot them both in the head. Their bodies were butchered like the others. They had come to help. They had risked everything for strangers, and in the end, they became food for the people they had tried to save. It is one of the darkest moments in a story full of darkness, the only confirmed murder for consumption in the entire Donner Party tragedy, and the victims were the only non-white members of the group. Of the 15 people who set out from the lake camp, 7 made it to Johnson's Ranch on January 18, 1847, 33 days after they left. 5 of the 7 survivors were women. This was not a coincidence. Women, with their higher percentage of body fat, were better able to survive extreme starvation. They required fewer calories to maintain basic functions. They were, quite literally, built to endure. The survivors stumbled into the ranch like figures from a nightmare, skeletal, frostbitten, barely able to speak. When they were finally able to tell their story, the ranchers were horrified. They immediately began organizing a rescue party to go back for the others. But the others were still 60 miles away, buried under 20 feet of snow, and they had been trapped for 2 months now. The Forlorn Hope had succeeded in getting help. But for many of the people they had left behind, the help would come too late. Back at the lake, the days blurred into each other. The snow kept falling, the food kept running out, and Patrick Breen kept writing in his diary, recording the slow death of hope in plain, terrible language. January 13th, snowing fast, snow higher than the shanty. Mrs. Reed and company, all well. January 27th, commenced snowing last night. A gun was fired about 3 o'clock. We hope for relief. February 5th, snowed hard, all until 12 o'clock last night. Mrs. Eddy died on the night of the 7th. The entries are remarkable for what they don't say as much as what they do. Breen records deaths with the same flat tone he uses to record the weather. He notes that families are all well when we know they were starving. He mentions that people have commenced eating unusual things without specifying what those things were. He was writing for himself, not for history. He had no idea that his diary would become one of the most important documents of the American West. He was just a farmer, trying to keep track of the days, trying to impose some kind of order on a world that had descended into chaos. 6 miles away at Alder Creek, the situation was even worse. The Donner families had never made it to the lake. They had built only crude lean-tos and tents, structures that offered almost no protection from the cold. George Donner, The patriarch who had led them into this disaster with his optimism and dreams was dying slowly from the infected wound in his hand. He could no longer walk. He could barely move. He lay in his tent, watching his family starve around him, knowing it was his fault. His wife Tamsin, the schoolteacher who had dreamed of educating California, refused to leave his side. She could have gone with the rescue parties when they came. She could have saved herself, but she would not abandon her husband, even though staying meant almost certain death. One by one, the hired hands and teamsters who had traveled with the Donnas began to die. Their bodies were not buried. The ground was frozen solid, and there was no one strong enough to dig graves. They were simply left in the snow, covered with branches, kept preserved by the cold until they were needed. And eventually, they were needed. It is impossible to say exactly when the cannibalism began at the camps. No one kept a record. No one wanted to remember. But we know that by late January or early February, the emigrants had run out of other options. The boiled hides were gone. The bones had been cracked open for their marrow. There was nothing left to eat except the bodies of those who had died. At the lake camp, the Reed children ate the flesh of Milt Elliott, a man who had been like an uncle to them, who had worked for their father and traveled with their family for months. Virginia Reed, 13 years old, later wrote that she did not know what she was eating at first. Her mother fed her thin strips of dried meat and told her it was from an animal. It was only later that she learned the truth. Other families made the same choice, with the same silence, the same desperate pretense that this was something other than what it was. Parents fed their children. Husbands fed their wives. Survivors fed each other. And no one spoke of where the food came from. The rules that had been established by the Forlorn Hope were followed at the camps as well. No one ate their own relatives. The bodies were butchered out of sight. The flesh dried and rendered unrecognizable before it was distributed. It was not a feast. It was a sacrament of survival performed in silence and shame. There were more than a dozen children at the camps, ranging from infants to teenagers. They saw everything. They understood more than the adults wanted them to understand. And they survived, in most cases, because their parents sacrificed everything to feed them. Patty Reed was 8 years old. Throughout all the horrors of the journey, the desert, the murders, the starvation, she had kept one small treasure, a tiny wooden doll, no bigger than her thumb, that she had hidden in the hem of her dress. That doll would survive the ordeal with her, and Patty would keep it for the rest of her life, a tiny reminder of the child she had been before the mountains. Eliza Donner was 3 years old. She would later write a book about the tragedy, based on her own fragmentary memories and the accounts of others. She remembered the cold. She remembered the hunger. She remembered her mother singing to her in the dark, trying to keep her calm, trying to make her believe that everything would be all right. The children who survived the Donner Party grew up to lead remarkable lives: teachers, farmers, business people, parents. But they never escaped what they had seen and done in those mountains. They carried it with them forever, a weight that never lifted, a memory that never faded. No account of the Donner Party is complete without discussing Louis Keseberg, the German immigrant who had become the story's most controversial figure. Keseberg had been disliked from the beginning of the journey. He was argumentative, abrasive, and had been accused of mistreating his wife. When the party banished James Reed for killing John Snyder, Keseberg had been one of the loudest voices calling for execution. At the lake camp, Keseberg was injured, his leg badly hurt in an earlier accident, and could not walk out with any of the rescue parties. He was left behind, alone, when the final relief party departed. When the fourth relief arrived weeks later, they found him living alone in the cabin, surrounded by human remains. The rescuers accused him of murder. They claimed he had killed Tamsin Donner, who had been alive when the third relief left. They said he had developed a preference for human flesh, that he had chosen to stay behind so he could continue eating. They said he had told them, with a terrible smile, that human flesh tasted better than beef. Keseberg denied the murder charge for the rest of his life. He admitted to eating human flesh. He had no choice, he said, but insisted that Tamsin Donner had died of natural causes, and that he had only consumed the dead, never the living. The truth is probably simpler and sadder than the legend. Keseberg was a difficult man who broke more visibly than the others, whose survival became a source of guilt and horror for those who had left him behind. Someone had to be the monster of the story. Someone had to bear the weight of what everyone had done. Keseberg, alone and friendless, became that someone. He lived out his days in California, shunned and despised, the scapegoat for a tragedy that had claimed dozens of lives and left everyone who survived it changed forever. The first rescue party left Johnson's ranch on February 4th, 1847, 3 weeks after the survivors of the Forlorn Hope stumbled out of the mountains. 7 men, carrying as much food as they could manage, climbed into the Sierra Nevada to search for the people they had left behind. What they found shocked even men who had been prepared for the worst. The cabins were buried under more than 20 feet of snow. Only the smoke from the chimneys showed where they were. The rescuers called out, and after a long moment, figures began to emerge from holes in the snow. Hollow-eyed, skeletal, barely human. Some of them wept. Others simply stared, unable to believe that help had finally come. The relief party had brought food, but not enough for everyone. They could only take the strongest with them, those who had a chance of surviving the trek out. 23 emigrants left with the first relief. The rest had to stay behind and wait for another rescue. Among those who stayed was Tamsin Donner, who refused to leave her dying husband. Among those who stayed were children too weak to walk. Among those who stayed was Louis Keseberg, with his injured leg, unable to travel. James Reed had survived his banishment. He had made it to California, half dead from hunger and exposure, and had immediately joined the war effort against Mexico. When word reached him that his family was trapped in the mountains, he organized a relief party of his own. The second relief, led by Reed, left in late February. They met the first relief coming out of the mountains, learned the terrible conditions at the camps, and pressed on. Reed's reunion with his children is one of the few moments of genuine light in this dark story. Virginia Reed, who had slipped him the rifle that saved his life, was overcome with joy at seeing her father alive. His wife Margaret, weak but surviving, wept in his arms. His younger children clung to him as if he might disappear again. But there was no time for celebration. The second relief had to move quickly before another storm trapped them all. Reed gathered the strongest survivors and began the march out of the mountains. His wife was too weak to travel. He had to leave her behind with a promise to return. The first relief, struggling through the snow with their charges, was caught by a storm. For 2 days, they huddled in the open while the wind howled and the temperature dropped. When the storm finally broke, 3 people were dead, all of them children. The survivors had no choice but to leave the bodies where they lay. They barely had the strength to save themselves, let alone carry the dead. And some of them, in their desperation, did what the Forlorn Hope had done before them. Even worse, some of the living were too weak to continue. They had to be left behind as well. 11 people, including 5 children, abandoned in the snow with the promise that another relief party would come for them. The third relief found them weeks later. Some were alive, some were dead, some had survived only by eating the dead. The rescuers gathered the survivors and continued on, leaving the others to the snow. The fourth relief, the last rescue party, arrived at the lake camp in mid-April, more than 4 months after the emigrants had become trapped. They found only one person still alive, Louis Kesselberg, alone in the Murphy cabin, surrounded by the remains of his fellow emigrants. The rescuers were horrified. The cabin looked like a slaughterhouse. Body parts were scattered everywhere. A pot hung over the fire, filled with something the rescuers did not want to identify. Kesselberg himself was in better condition than anyone had a right to expect. Strong enough to walk, well-fed, his eyes bright and aware. The rescuers accused him of murder on the spot. They demanded to know what had happened to Tamsin Donner, who had been alive when the third relief departed. Kesselberg told them she had died naturally, that he had done nothing wrong. They did not believe him. One of the rescuers, a man named Tucker, later recorded Kesselberg's words as he described eating human flesh. "I ate the arm of a young woman who had the most delicate arm I ever saw." Whether Kesselberg actually said this, or whether Tucker invented it to blacken Kesselberg's name, we will never know. Kesselberg was taken out of the mountains, the last survivor to leave, and the camps of the Donner Party were finally, mercifully empty. Of the 87 people who set out with the Donner Party, 48 survived. 39 died. In the desert, in the mountains, in the snow. They died of starvation, exposure, exhaustion, and despair. They died quickly, and they died slowly. They died surrounded by family, and they died utterly alone. The pattern of survival was striking. 2/3 of the men died. 2/3 of the women lived. Almost all of the children under 5 perished. The old and the weak were taken first. The strong and the fortunate held on until rescue came. The survival rate for men versus women has been studied extensively. Women, with their higher body fat percentages and lower caloric needs, were simply better suited to survive starvation. Men burned hotter and died faster. It was biology, not virtue, that determined who lived and who died. The survivors of the Donner Party scattered across California, trying to build new lives. Most of them never spoke of what had happened in the mountains. Some changed their names. Some moved far from anyone who might recognize them. They married, had children, grew old, and died, carrying their secret shame to the grave. Virginia Reed, who had given her father the rifle that saved his life, grew up to be a respectable matron in California. She wrote one account of the tragedy at the request of a cousin, and then fell silent. In her later years, she rarely mentioned it. When she did speak of the experience, she offered one piece of advice to future emigrants. Never take no cut-offs and hurry along as fast as you can. It was all the wisdom she had to offer. Don't trust shortcuts. Don't waste time. The margin for error is smaller than you think. Louis Kesselberg was put on trial of sorts when he reached California. The Fourth Relief accused him of murdering Tamsin Donner and stealing money from the dead. A kind of informal tribunal was held, with witnesses and testimony. Kesselberg was not convicted of murder. There was no real evidence, only suspicion and hatred. But he was found liable for the theft of property from the camps and ordered to pay restitution. He later sued one of his accusers for defamation and won a verdict of $1. He lived the rest of his life in California, operating a small brewery, married and widowed multiple times, always shadowed by the reputation of being the monster of the Donner Party. He died in 1895, still insisting on his innocence, still claiming he had done nothing that any other man would not have done in the same circumstances. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps he was simply the one who got caught being human in an inhuman situation. Or perhaps he really was a murderer who escaped justice through lack of evidence. We will never know. The story of the Donner Party became a legend almost immediately. Newspapers across America reported the horror in lurid detail. Dime novels embroidered the facts with fiction. The tale was told and retold, growing more sensational with each telling. The cannibalism became the entire story. The months of struggle, the desperate decisions, the heroism and the sacrifice, all of it was reduced to a single, shocking word. The Donner Party became a punchline, a cautionary tale, a synonym for the worst thing humans could do to each other. But the survivors remembered it differently. They remembered the mothers who fed their children their own portions. They remembered the fathers who died so their families could live. They remembered Charles Stanton, who returned to help people who weren't even his family and died alone in the snow. They remembered the two Miwok guides, Luis and Salvador, who gave their lives trying to save strangers. The Donner Party was not just a story about cannibalism. It was a story about what people will do to survive and what they will sacrifice to save the ones they love. The Donner Party is America's origin story turned inside out. These were ordinary people chasing the American dream, land, prosperity, a better life for their children. They did everything right. They planned carefully. They saved their money. They believed in the future. They set out with hope in their hearts and the promise of paradise ahead, and they ended up in hell. The lesson of the Donner Party is not that these people were monsters. The lesson is that they were not. They were teachers and farmers, merchants and homemakers. They were people like us, with the same dreams and fears, the same capacity for love, and the same potential for darkness. We want to believe we would be different. We would make better decisions. We would stay strong. We would die with dignity rather than cross that line. But the Donner Party teaches us something we don't want to know. Under extreme circumstances, the line between civilization and savagery is much thinner than we like to believe. The story is not about monsters. It is about mothers who fed their children the only food available. It is about fathers who made impossible choices so their families could live. It is about the question that haunted every survivor for the rest of their days. What would you have done? Today, you can drive past Donner Lake on Interstate 80. There is a monument there, a bronze plaque and a statue marking the site where 87 people were trapped and 39 died. Most drivers glance at it and keep going, thinking about the next rest stop, the next meal, the next destination. They don't stop to read the names. They don't think about the children. But now you know their story. You know about Virginia Reed and her tiny wooden doll. You know about Tamsin Donner. who refused to leave her dying husband. You know about Luis and Salvador, who gave their lives trying to help strangers. You know about the Forlorn Hope, who walked 33 days through snow and death to bring rescue. And that is the only monument that matters, being remembered, not as monsters, not as victims, but as human beings who faced the worst of what this world can offer and who showed us who we really are. What would you have done? Let us know in the comments below. If this story haunts you like it haunts us, like this video and subscribe for more histories that have been buried under the snow of time. Click the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching.